Spendthrift Trust: How to protect trust property from irresponsible beneficiaries and their creditors. A spendthrift trust is a trust property control mechanism that restricts the beneficiary's access to trust principal. This limit protects trust property from either a beneficiary who might misuse trust property or from the beneficiary's creditors. When a grantor wants to leave property to a beneficiary but is worried that the beneficiary will not use the property wisely or that he or she might get into trouble with creditors, the grantor then sets up a spendthrift trust. Watch now for more information. Welcome back, folks, to another edition of City Kiwi. How are you doing today? I hope you are doing fantastic. I am doing terrific, if you were to ask me. If you are doing as great as I am, go grab a cup of coffee or tea or vodka and let's roll. Today, I want to have a conversation with you around spendthrift trust, how to protect trust property from irresponsible beneficiaries and their creditors. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to take a few minutes to get the terminology straight. Let's get it straight. When you hear terms like grantor, beneficiary, trustee, and trust principal throughout this show, I want you to understand what they really mean. What is a grantor? A grantor is the person who transfers property into a trust. And when you hear the terms grantor and settlor, they mean the same thing. They're synonyms. Settlor spells S-E-T-T-L-O-R, not E-O-R. For instance, if you transfer property into a trust, you become a grantor or a settlor. Next, beneficiary. The person who receives a benefit from the trust is called a beneficiary. This could be, if you are the grantor, you can appoint your child, your aunt, your uncle, or a friend, or even a charity, an organization, the beneficiary. Next, we have a trustee. A trustee is the person who controls trust property according to the terms of the trust. So the settlor will actually sit down and lay out the foundation of the trust, lay out instructions in the trust, and it's up to the trustee to abide by them and enforce those instructions. The trustee can be a person or an organization. As a matter of fact, a lot of financial institutions, including banks and financial and insurance companies, have trusteeships department, and they help clients, especially when it comes to wealth management clients, take care of a few things when it comes to trusts. So besides grantor, beneficiaries, and trustees, you have something called a trust principal. It's essentially the property put into a trust, as opposed to the income created by the trust. By property, don't just think about tangible property. Of course, property, we have real estate, we have machinery, but those are tangible properties. You can also have intangible or electronic or financial property, financial instruments, stock, bonds, ETFs, so electronically traded funds. You can also have business interests. Those will qualify also as principal. You can transfer your interest if you have interest. Let's say you have shares in a LLC, in a partnership, in a company, in a corporation, a C Corp or S Corp. You can assign, you can transfer that equity, that ownership into a trust. Now that we have clarified the basic terminology used in spendthrift trust, let's now talk about how a spendthrift trust really works. A spendthrift trust puts restrictions on the beneficiary's access to trust principal. Basically, what you have here is that the beneficiary cannot access the trust principal or promise it to anyone else. Because the beneficiary cannot access trust funds, neither can his or her creditors. So you are essentially shielding that beneficiary from harming himself or herself, and also harming the trust by squandering the funds. Instead of having direct access to trust property, the beneficiary receives benefit from the trust through the trustee named in the trust. So, for instance, the trustee can send regular payments to the beneficiary so that he or she, the trustee in this case, makes sure that the trust principal is always taken care of, is always shielded, is always preserved. And so that if stuff happens, if the beneficiary spends the income unwisely, it's okay, because or gets a lien on that income because of he or she owes people, it's still okay because trust principle will be taken care of. This benefit could be benefits that the trustee sends to the beneficiary regularly, can be in the form of a regular payment, as I said earlier. So a regular payment from the trust, or in the form of goods or services bought for the beneficiary by the trustee. How and when the trustee makes payment to the beneficiary is determined by the terms of the trust. So everything has to be specifically laid out in the trust. If you are the grantor or the settlor, you have to lay out specifically how you want the beneficiary to receive payments and when. I'm going to talk later on about the role of the trustee in the show to sort of shed light also on that aspect of things. So after a payment is made to the beneficiary, that money is also available to creditors. Because as I said earlier, the goal of a spendthrift trust is to preserve the principal, not the income generated from that principal. The distinguishing, let me give you a template sentence you might see or you might want to include in a spendthrift trust to differentiate that trust from other kinds of trust. No part of the income or principal of this trust shall be subject to anticipation, alienation, or assignment by any beneficiary. Let me repeat that. This is the kind of distinguishing legal language you might see in a spendthrift trust. No part of the income or principal of this trust shall be subject to anticipation, alienation, or assignment by any beneficiary. I'll be right back right after this. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks, to another edition of Sweetie Kiwi. How are you doing today? I hope you are doing fantastic. I'm doing marvelous, if you were to ask me. And if you love the clarity and quality of the content so far, please consider subscribing to our channel and turn on the notification bell. I want you to just to smash that sub button for us, please. Also, comment below, like this content, and share. If you ask questions, our team reviews all questions, and if the questions is relevant, in other words, relates to the topic at hand, we will answer. We answer all questions that are relevant. Let's talk now about when a spendthrift trust is useful. A spendthrift trust is most useful when the grantor wants to leave property or money to a beneficiary, but worries that the gift might be squandered if the beneficiary has control of it. There are multiple reasons why a grantor might not want a beneficiary to have total access or total control, or that he or she, the grantor that is, might not trust a beneficiary with the responsibility of controlling his or her trust funds. Let's give a few examples here. The beneficiary might be, or the grantor might believe that the beneficiary is not good with money, has an addiction that could cause him or her to squander the funds, that the beneficiary might be easily deceived or defrauded, or might easily fall into debt with creditors. In any of these scenarios, a spendthrift trust allows a trustee to provide for the beneficiary from the trust without risking that the trust principal will be wasted by misuse, drugs, gambling, a misguided relationship, or excessive debt. So the idea here, the central idea here, is to preserve again the trust principal against the benefit from the beneficiary or from his or her creditors. So you're trying to set boundaries to make sure that if you have quote unquote an irresponsible beneficiary, that beneficiary will not harm the trust. This is especially critical if you have a large family and you have several children who rely on the trust principle. The last thing you want is to have one beneficiary who is unwise, who makes unwise decisions, and by doing that is endangering the whole trust principle and also endangering the future, the welfare of all other children. Now let's talk about the role of the trustee, as I promised you earlier. When it comes to a spendthrift trust, the trustee plays a quintessential role. When it comes to administering the special needs trust, remember, when you hear the words spendthrift trust and special needs trust, those are the same. The terms of the trust put the trustee in control of the trust property and of any benefit that the beneficiary ultimately receives. The terms of the trust should describe the trustee's power in detail. We cannot allow confusion or lack of clarity here. There could be a wide range of possibilities. For instance, a grantor might require the trustee to make set payments to the beneficiary every month or every quarter, or the trustee may be given the power to decide how much money, if any, the trustee should receive and send to the beneficiary. When making a spendthrift trust, though, it is important that a settlor consider a few things. So a grantor must consider how much control to give to the trustee. It's all about trust, right? The key word, the root here is trust. So the trustee, the kind of power, the expanse of power, if you will, the expanse of legal powers assigned ultimately to the trustee must hinge upon the trust that the settlor has in the trustee. For instance, key questions could be: should the trustee make cash payments to the beneficiary? Or should the trustee have the discretion to buy the beneficiary goods and services for the beneficiary's family, for the beneficiary himself or herself? If payments are to be made, how often should they occur? How should the amount of payments be determined? Is it a percentage of the principal, a determined amount, or maybe a percentage of the trust income? Should the trustee have the power to not make payments at all? If so, what are the circumstances that will determine whether or not the trustee should release or withhold payments? For instance, if you have a beneficiary who gambles, gets into a questionable relationship, and you have the danger of a costly divorce looming, or you have a beneficiary who gets into debt. So a spendthrift trust must be carefully crafted to reflect the unique circumstances of the grantor and beneficiary. And all kinds of scenarios are possible here, because we're talking about human beings and people have different lives, different needs, different priorities, right? The grantor must consider the burden that the trust will put onto the trustee. Will the trust essentially make the trustee a babysitter for the beneficiary? In other words, having to evaluate on a monthly basis or quarterly basis or periodic basis the beneficiary's behavior to determine whether the trustee can properly distribute funds to the beneficiary. What I'm trying to say here is to make sure that when you are the grantor or settlor and you are laying out specific instructions, don't put too much professional weight onto the trustee. Remember, a trustee can oversee gazillions of trusts. Yours is not the only trust he or she is taking care of. So the job description of the trustee, the instructions you are indicating in the trust document must be clear, but not too overwhelming. The grantor can be the trustee of the trust, or he or she can name someone else to do the job. The grantor should also name a successor trustee who will take over when the grantor dies. The beneficiary can never, ever be a trustee. I will be right back right after this. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks, to another edition of Sweetie Kiwi. How are you doing today? I hope you are still enjoying this conversation. We are having a conversation here around spendthrift trust, how to protect trust property from irresponsible beneficiaries and their creditors. So I've spoken to you about how a spendthrift trust works. When is it useful? Spoken a little bit about the role of the trustee, and also mentioned the fact that the grantor or settlor can be a trustee, but the beneficiary can never be a trustee. Now let's talk about how to set up a spendthrift trust. You can get help from a lawyer to craft a spendthrift trust. The lawyer will ask you a detailed list of questions to make sure this kind of trust is right for you and to find out what you want to accomplish with the trust. Besides, you also need to think about what role you want your trustee to play. I think I spoke at length about the responsibilities and roles of a trustee. You may need to consider certain things also. When and how do you want the trust to end? What should happen to the trust principal if the beneficiary's circumstances change? For instance, if the beneficiary dies or gains the ability to manage trust funds. Yes, this could happen. This can happen. Courts might decide later on to assign the responsibility or the ability, the oversight of the trust funds to the beneficiary. Things happen. Another question you want to consider when having a conversation with the lawyer is whether or not you want to allow for special payouts if the beneficiary encounters large expenses, such as enrollment in college or a long illness. So you have a regular scenario. Which is every month the beneficiary gets some money from the trust principal, and you have an irregular or extraordinary scenario when stuff happens, when there is a big life change, a life event, and you want to think about what kind of special payouts, if any, you want to set up for those events. If all of this sound complicated, it can be. So you want to ask for a lawyer. You want to ask your attorney for help figuring out what is best for your situation. Now, you have two other options when it comes to setting up a spendthrift trust. But before I give you those two other options, please remember, this show is not about giving any kind of legal advice. We're not lawyers. We do research. Our team does research, and we are presenting to you a synopsis of that research. Everybody's situation is different, so it's always better to reach out to a specialist. Let me give you the other two options you can use when it comes to setting up a spendthrift trust. You can use templates. There are gazillions of templates on the internet. If you type spendthrift trust template, you'll have a long list of templates that you can use. That comes up with some of those templates. We've seen them while doing preparing for this show, and some of those templates are very sophisticated and very complete, very comprehensive. Besides templates, you can also use special software. So you have estate planning software that offers a diverse range of services and documents embedded in the software, and a spendthrift trust is one of those documents you can find in any software, any good spendthrift trust software. We don't give names here in this show, but if you type on the internet, you Google or Bing this term, you will get a lot of well-reviewed software programs. All right, folks, let's recap today's conversation. So today I was talking to you about spendthrift trust, how to protect trust property from irresponsible beneficiaries and their creditors. And I spoke about 4 important things. 1, how does a spendthrift trust work? 2, when is a spendthrift trust useful? 3, what is the role of the trustee? 4, how to set up a spendthrift trust. The gist of today's conversation is that you want to protect trust principal. If you are engaged, if you are a grantor or settlor and you want to set up this kind of a special needs trust, aka spendthrift trust, it's just because you want to preserve the principle of the trust. And you use this kind of trust when you realize that the trustee might be currently or in the future irresponsible or unwise or making unwise decisions. And you want to lay out the role of the trustee clearly. And you want to use the help of an attorney if possible. I'll see you next time, but until then, remember, stay marvelous.